Good evening, everyone. Can still hear people joining us on Zoom in the background. Good evening and welcome to Scudic Institute. My name is Susie Acord and I serve as the development coordinator here. I want to thank you for being here with us tonight and welcome you to this evening's lecture on wild mushrooms in Maine with Greg Marley as part of our summer lecture series. This evening's event is made possible by our generous sponsor, Darlene's Auto Mall, and with support from folks like all of you. Thank you for helping to support programs like these, as well as science and education that we're doing here at the Institute. A couple of housekeeping notes. Tonight we do have a hybrid audience with all of you here in the auditorium. We've got a great turnout, thank you. And also people who are joining from near and far on Zoom. Thank you to our Zoom participants as well. Tonight's lecture is being recorded and will be sent out to everyone who registered for this evening's event. If you did not register or you want to share the video with friends, it will also be available on our YouTube channel in about a week. Also, bathrooms are located just to the right when you exit the auditorium. At Scudic Institute, our mission is inspiring science, learning, and community for a changing world. Mushrooms are one of these topics that elicit curiosity and desire to learn more. They fascinate us with their color, their size, their shape. They evoke emotions in us of wonder and awe, and sometimes even disgust. They are also critically important organisms for the health of our forests, forming beneficial relationships with trees and other plants. They are amazing decomposers that help build healthy soil, and they serve as food and medicine for people and animals. Paying attention to what's around us is a big part of the work that we do here at the Institute. And I'm really excited that we have Greg here with us this month. If you've been out in the woods recently, you'll know that there are a lot of mushrooms fruiting right now, and it's a wonderful time to go out and observe them. With that, I'd like to introduce Greg, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him. Greg has been collecting, studying, eating, growing, and teaching about mushrooms for over 45 years. He has spread his love of mushrooms to hundreds of people through walks, talks, and classes across New England for more than 30 years. He is the author of Mushrooms for Health, Medicinal Secrets of Northeastern Fungi, and also the award-winning book, Chanterelle Dreams, Amanita Nightmares, The Love, Lore, and Mystique of Mushrooms. As a volunteer mushroom identification consultant to poison centers across New England since 2001, Greg provides expertise in mushroom poisoning cases. When he's not mushrooming, Greg works as a mental health clinician and behavioral health consultant specializing in suicide prevention. Greg, thank you for being here and sharing your knowledge with us this evening.
I'm always embarrassed with those introductions. I don't know why, it just doesn't sound like me. But we're gonna be here and we're gonna romp through the world of mushrooms for about an hour and 12 minutes. And then I'm gonna take questions and answers. Anybody have answers, I'll take those as well. And we're gonna have people on Zoom. They're gonna type in their questions on the chat. You guys get to vocalize them here in the room. And if there is a burning question and you're really an extrovert, raise your hand while we're doing it and maybe we can go that way. But mostly we're gonna save most of the questions to the end. So we're gonna cover a lot of turf today and using photographs. Almost all of these are photographs of Maine mushrooms. All of them are photographs of New England mushrooms. There may be a couple in there from New Mexico. I don't think so. And I took them all. So these are mushrooms we can find. Much of the mushrooms we're going to show tonight are ones that we should see from here on in through the season. But really, first we're going to focus on ecology. So we're going to talk about a little bit just the beauty, the wonder, the mystique of mushrooms, because that's what captured me first, and it still captures me every time I step into the forest or walk a field or drive down the road, particularly this time of year. My wife is a little bit worried about my driving ability because I get distracted. So we're going to talk about the ecology, the role of mushrooms as was mentioned a little bit about. We're going to talk a lot more about that. And we're going to touch on that thing that we're all worried about, climate change, and the impact of changing weather patterns on what we're seeing in the forest, and when we're seeing it, and how long we see it into the fall. And then just a little few mushrooms that everyone needs to know. And depending on where we get to the end, I'm going to talk a little bit of guidelines of where you go from here. So just a quick show of hands, and we can't do that for the folks that are on Zoom, but in the room here, how many people have collected and eaten at least one wild mushroom? And how many people did that in the state of Maine? And if you were not from the state of Maine, how many of them were morels? And if you're from the state of Maine, how many of them were morels? No hands go up. One, yeah. I get them every year, but they're not very common here. All right, and how many people here are primarily driven by your belly in terms of your interest in mushrooms, foraging and feeding? How many people here are primarily or secondarily driven by a love of nature and ecology and how they fit into our environment? All right, I think that covers most everybody. Anybody else has got another burning desire on what you're interested in tonight? Okay, medicinal, that's still our belly. Learning how to collect them. We probably won't get deeply into that tonight. We're going to touch on a few, but we come back for another day long or week long. Next year, the first week of September, my partner and I, Michaeline, will be up in Eagle Hill in Steuben. We call it mushroom camp, and boy, you'll get more than you ever want. All right, so that's what we're going to touch on tonight. But first, ever since, the work I do in my day job is pretty weighty. And even before I started doing suicide prevention and intervention work, for the forest, nature was always a place where I retreated to reconnect with myself. And to quote that old naturalist John Moore, and into the forest I go to lose my mind and find my soul. So I'm going to invite you into that world, because every time you step into the forest with your eyes open, the mushrooms, the insects, the plants, the general tenor of the climate is going to capture you. So for me, it's to escape. It's a way to quiet my mind. It's an opportunity to slow down from the pace that we've set ourselves upon. Always, it's an invitation to key into and to attune all of your senses. Your eyes, your hearing, your sense of smell. I never realized how automatically I smell a mushroom when I pick it. Until I was out with my son, and he was about heading 17 months or so. He was toddling around the forest, and he would pick up a mushroom. We go, I said, "What are you doing?" And I realized he was following and copying his dad. So smell, the touch, all the senses are there. And as the Russians call it, for me, initially it was always driven by my gut, got much more diversified, but they call mushrooming the quiet hunt. No hounds, no guns, but still that keying into the ecology, where we're going to find, what are we looking for, how to approach it, all of those things. It's the quiet hunt. So first, the beauty. Gorgeous architectural gems, grace that is unmatched. And every color you can imagine is present in the world of mushrooms. People often think, well, they're either white or brown, right? White or brown or blue or orange or yellow or red or pink or purple. Yeah. So last year, in almost every forest that I stepped into that had oak, I found this mushroom. Most years, I feel blessed if I find it once. That to me is part of the mystery that I'm still keying into. There's a forest not far from where I work in Hollowell, and that's where I take my 20, 25-minute break at lunch to clear my head. And some years, there's this gorgeous lilac bolete called Boletus separans all over in there. This year, there's an entirely different, radically different species in the same area, and only that one. I see no other Boletus separans. So what is the mystery? What triggers this one to come all over the state last year, but I may not see it in years? And the beauty, so there's a little milk cap, they're called Lactarius, and this is Lactarius indigo. And so I cut the little curls from it to form these hearts. And when you cut it, the latex, the sap almost that's in this mushroom is brilliant, brilliant blue. I mean, this doesn't quite do it justice. It's so bright. The colors of boletes are astounding. The one in that beautiful reddish one, that's called frost bolete. The one up top with the white gills and the orange or the reddish gills, or excuse me, the yellowish gills, that's the chestnut bolete. It's a lovely edible. Now, if you're interested in eating mushrooms and you're starting out, boletes are intermediate. They're tougher. There's a few that are easy, but not all of them. But this chestnut, this year, that same area where I was finding that beautiful Carminipes bolete in the forest, down in the lowest pockets where after a heavy rain, the rain would puddle, I found these little chestnut boletes. One of the finest tasting boletes that I know, very nutty flavor. Small, biggest ones are about 1.5 inches. And then the color. I was up in Rangeley, I was telling one of the folks here a couple of weeks ago. And Rangeley, you know how dry it's been here? How few mushrooms there's been? Rangeley's been blessed. That part of the state has really gotten regular rains, and it was a fairyland. So a lot of fresh chanterelles coming, and a lot of this gorgeous Cortinarius called Cortinarius violaceus. Grows worldwide in forested areas, but just that deep, deep blue-purple color. And the other quartz, this is called it's called the Cortinarius semisanguineus. If you know your Latin, it means somewhat bloody. The color of those gills. And my bicolor bolete, which is one of my favorite edibles. And some of the boletes, you'll see, they will have the ability to stain. If you scratch it or bruise it, the tissue, and when it interacts with oxygen, stains blue. So is this a blue stainer? Somewhat reluctant sometimes. So I put a smile on its face. And also in oak forest, usually, is Russell's bolete. It's like this ragged stem that's so gorgeous. How many people here love the texture of okra? How many people can't stand that texture? For those of you who can't stand it, you would not like this bolete, because the stems, lovely flavor, but that viscid texture of okra. Yeah. And then always keep in mind that what we eat also provides food for just a wide range of animals across the forest. This is Neohelix albularis, the white-lipped snail. And I made a study of finding it because there was a woman I know that was who wrote a book called The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating. You ever seen that book? It's a lovely exploration of her experience with really deep, debilitating illness. And someone gave her a plant that a snail crawled out of. And she was almost paralyzed, but she would watch this snail for days. It would go back up to the plant, it would come out. And so she wrote a book about her experience of healing. And then she was making a movie of it, and she wanted to find these Neohelix snails so she could photograph them and then film them. And I was her guy. They're nocturnal, so they're not always easy to find, but they love mushrooms. So she said, Greg, you'll be able to find them. And this is, right along the coast here, those sea breezes that bring in the moisture and bring in those rich, thick mats of moss. They also are a really glorious place for things like hiddenellums. This is a tooth mushroom. This is called the orange hiddenellum. Remember those dreamsicles we used to have as kids? They probably still exist. This is called the dreamsicle mushroom. The texture and color of that. And when I found that, there was this arc that was probably about 25 feet long under these fir trees. It's just glorious. And then what I'm aware of, especially with the Poison Center, is mushrooms are pulling us in. Mushrooms are incredibly, I'm keeping my phone on because I am on call for the Poison Center. So they're pulling us in. How many people here grew up learning to fear mushrooms? Don't touch that. Go wash your hands. Yeah. That was America 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. I come from a family with an Irish father, total mycophobe. He did not allow my mother to cook with mushrooms. She stuck a few in. That 2-noodle casserole with the cream of mushroom soup, that's about it though. And she was French and German. Years later, after I started collecting and eating mushrooms, she admitted that when she was growing up on the ranch in Montana, she and her mother would go out and collect mushrooms. But not when I was growing up. As a mycophobic culture, everything was, suspect. Better kicked than picked. And the garden centers get the calls and say, how can I get rid of all those mushrooms in our yard? And I say, well, you can asphalt over it, but even then, sometimes the mushrooms push through. But then other places love them. All of the Eastern Europeans, the Russians, Estonians, Romanians, Central Europe, French, Germans, the Swiss, highlands of Mexico, Chinese, the Japanese. In those places, people love mushrooms. They learn mushrooms with their ABCs. And the fairy tales have glorious stories of mushrooms in them. But now that's catching on here. How many people saw that film, Fantastic Fungi? How many people said, well, there's a little bit too much psychedelic paisley for me? That was me. But a lot of great information. So we're really getting it. Part of it is because of foraging, locally sourced, sustainably foraged mushrooms. That competition of who can get the longest life list of edibles. Please don't do that. You're going to get sick. And everybody's doing it. And nowadays, everybody is interested in those psychedelics. And where can I find them? And can I grow them? And what is that microdosing stuff? I'm amazed how rapidly that's trying to catch on. And so here's our question. When you come upon a mushroom in the forest, is it a mushroom or is it a toadstool? Toadstool to me is like a weed. It's a mushroom that you don't know if you can eat it and you don't trust it, and so maybe it's suspect. I don't use that term anymore. So this is the artwork of a gorgeous artist named Beatrix Cromwell, and she made everything into toadstools, and she's got a couple of these. They're lots of fun. And if you look carefully, in fact, where's Susie? Is that the one you were found this week? Chicken lips, yeah. Leosha ventricosa. So it keeps us fun. So mushrooms as a food source? Yeah. They need a food source. Like us, they're autotrophs. And mushrooms in the forest, they get their food in one of several ways. Many of them are saprobes. They rot stuff. In fact, much of the kingdom of fungi have evolved out of the ocean along with plants to start out being their undertakers. And they break down plant matter rapidly, and if they didn't, everything would grind to a halt because they recycle all of the basic nutrients that are bound up in dead plant tissue. In the twigs, and the needles, and the trunks, and the roots. So many mushrooms are saprobes, and we'll look at those. We're going to talk about the symbiotic relationship, the mycorrhizal mushrooms separately. We'll also touch on parasites. And sometimes, it's hard for us to tell, and it's rarely all one or the other, and we feel like we're fumbling giants, trying to pick up the pins and needles. in our efforts to learn some of this material. So as rotters, we need them. And I bring this in, I call this fungus king because it looks so much like Angus. And this is a sculpture by a man named Tom Cohen. It was in Belfast for a number of years. It was a maple tree that they cut down, and I would go by it regularly. For about 5 years, I would watch the parade of different species of saprobic fungi that colonized it and started fruiting. And finally, you could see the artist conch starting to grow out the side. And then the face started to get discolored by the mycelium of that artist conch, and they said, okay, we're going to cut this out to preserve the artwork. But for me, anytime we put out wood waste or plant waste, straw, dead grass, we are calling in the fungus. We're inviting them to dine because that's what they're going to do. So they break down all kinds of plant material. They can break down some animal material as well, and they recycle those nutrients. They build soil, they reclaim soil. We're getting much better at using them in some of those schema, and I'll talk about that in a second. So anytime we've got wood out there, it's going to grow mushrooms. So this guy, this American bald eagle, was on the road to Belfast on the road to Augusta, around 17. And I passed by it on my way to and from work pretty regularly. And I just was waiting and waiting and waiting. And about midsummer last year, he suddenly sprouted a batch of mushrooms, little Panis neostrigosus. And in this picture here, he looks like he's looking back on his back saying, what the heck is this? So we'll see what the next batch is. They cleaned him up and put a new coat of paint on him this year. So some rotters also develop fruiting bodies that really are lovely to eat. And this year, this hot, dry, droughty summer, then followed by intermittent, heavy thunder showers, that is perfect recipe to encourage some of the saprobes. Meadow mushrooms, some of the puffballs. Anybody know the parasol mushroom? Really popular in Europe. You know, I've gotten a lot of that the past few weeks in these intermittent rains. So the shaggy mane is something we're going to expect to see, you know, in the next month to begin. Likes to come about the first frost. The little Polyporus undulatus and the giant puffball. I haven't seen any giant puffballs yet, but I've been seeing a lot of what we call the purple spore puffball in a number of areas across the state the past 2 weeks. And then here's your chaga. You know, wood decay fungi create opportunities for animals to make their cavities much easier. They did a study of some of the threatened and endangered woodpeckers in the western part of the country. And they found that they were targeting these great big 70, 80, 100-year-old aspens, quaking aspens there, and that they could figure out which of them have a heart-rotting fungus in them, I think from the sound when they were banging their heads against her. Even if the fruiting bodies of the Phelinus tremelle, which is one of the species that targets it, were not there. And so this is a species of or growth of chaga on birch, and you can see some enterprising woodpecker had carved a hole there for either a nesting cavity or feeding. Yeah. So look at that as you walk through your woods and you find that dead hemlock or spruce, and how often you will see the cavities, you know, where they're also fruiting bodies. And we use that same ability of mushrooms in mycoremediation. And it's still in its infancy. Became really famous by Paul Stamets when he grew oyster mushrooms on soil that was contaminated with petroleum. He mixed it with straw and sawdust, inoculated it with oyster mushroom mycelium, and the mycelium grew through that soil and organic matter, fruiting bodies. And when they analyzed the fruiting bodies, there were no trace of the petroleum components because the mycelium had used it as food and totally consumed it. So that ability is something that is being studied around the world on applications in real world situations, on oil fuel, fouled ground, and other types of things. We're using them in areas where there's been heavy forest fire and damage. Yeah. It's a great way to begin using organic matter and the mushrooms to rebuild the soil. So this is an example of a forested, burned area in western part of the country, and they have these wattle that's filled with straw and sawdust and the mycelium of mushrooms, and the runoff is slowed down and filtered through it, and the fungus consume some of the toxins. Now, if there's heavy metals in there, it doesn't eat and decontaminate the heavy metals, so they're still present in the fruiting bodies. So we can find, how many people, anybody here ever cultivated mushrooms? One of the things you can do with oyster mushrooms, they eat anything that's cellulose based, including dungarees. So old dungarees are a great place to grow oyster mushrooms. And in your gardens, in my garden right now, I have beds of this mushroom. I live down in Rockland, and we have very heavy clay soil where we built this house. And so I have raised beds, and in between my raised beds, I put wood chips. I've been fortunate enough to get a great couple batches of maple. And I've spread the wood chips as a path, and I inoculate them with the mycelium of this mushroom. And amazingly easy to grow these edible mushrooms. They're beautiful. So all these were taken photographs from my garden. I'm too lazy to grow mushrooms inside these days. I really want to be out in the woods. So that's the saprobes, the rotters. The other major lifestyle choice for many fungus is to grow symbiotically with plants. And we live in a world where approximately 90% of our green plants worldwide form some type of symbiotic relationship with fungi. There's two groups, the endomycorrhizal and ectomycorrhizal. The endomycorrhizal don't produce fruiting bodies that we can see. They're microscopic. But the ectomycorrhizal really do. And what they do is they act as an extended root system. And they are paired together, and one without the other don't do well. So here's a photograph. And this is a famous one. It's on the cover of a symbiotic mycorrhizal symbiosis, a book published a few years back. And on this photograph, you can see this Pinus sylvestris seedling. And the end of its roots are there and there and there. Everything else you see in this photograph, it was growing between sheets of glass, that's fungal mycelium. It's the mycelium, the vegetative growth of a type of bolete called a swillus. And so it colonizes, and the mycelium spread out and are very, very efficient about gathering water and mineral nutrients. And they bring them up to the plant. And everywhere you see, whoops, let me go back here. These little clusters right there, little knobs, that's where they exchange those nutrients. And what they get from the plant is the sugars that they make through photosynthesis. So they colonize this plant, and later they put in 2 more seeds, and they got those started, and that same individual fungus colony colonized those trees as well. So in our forest, you walk in the forest here on the peninsula, where you've got heavy, some birch, spruce, some fir, those are the dominant species. Every step of soil where you walk is miles and miles of this mushroom mycelium that are growing symbiotically with the roots. And without them, forests don't grow. We learned that early on when we started taking pine trees and planting them in Australia and New Zealand, because those crooked trees, those eucalyptus, weren't good for timber. So we started planting pine trees. And when we brought the seedlings with soil and we stuck them in the ground, they thrived. They did wonderfully. So we started doing an industry of growing them out from seed. They grew them out. They did okay in the nursery, and they put them out in the soil, and they languished. They said, "What's missing?" And someone got the idea there's some magic in the soil where they're from. And so they started bringing soil from Europe to Australia to plant with the trees. Talk about bringing coal to Newcastle. And then this German mycologist or a microbiologist said, no, there's some magic in the soil, and we need to figure out what it is. And he realized it was the fungus that grow in the soil that partner with the plants. And then they started figuring that out and carrying it forward. So 90% of our plants do it. Every forest in the world, whether it be northern boreal or tropic. And what we find is those plants that are colonized by mycorrhizal mushrooms do better at the growth and health of their root system, their ability to take up moisture, to sustain themselves in drought conditions. So they're just much healthier in so many ways. Now, if we kill all the fungus in a field, like this was a former potato field that had blight, and so they really killed everything. And then they planted these seedling conifers for Christmas trees. And you can see, that this one, many of them are languishing because they'd killed off all the mycorrhizal symbionts. And over time, they found little pockets that did better. They needed to bring in, and we've learned a lot about inoculating even our garden soil with healthy mycorrhizal associates. So many of the mushrooms that we prize as edibles in the state of Maine grow symbiotically, which means we can't figure out how to cultivate them without their plants. The chanterelles, the black trumpets, all of the boletes, as well as many poisonous mushrooms like the amanitas, all symbiotic. So all these boletes, this is the variations on the king bolete or porcini from Maine, one of my favorite mushrooms. Just starting to see those popping now as we get some more rain. And I'm just going to tell a tale. How many people know the Indian pipe or ghost pipe? Yeah. Is it a plant? Is it a fungus? Is it neither? It's a flower. It's a plant, but it lacks chlorophyll, right? So it doesn't make its own food. And back when I took my naturalist training course in Sharon, Connecticut with the Audubon Center in 1974, they said, well, the Indian pipe is a saprobe. It derives its food from rotting dead plants. And it's so much more interesting and complex. We call it a mycoheterotroph, which is a big word that is meaningless to most of us. It keys into the relationship between a group of mushrooms called Ruschula and the trees that they grow symbiotically with. And the roots of this Indian pipe key into that mycelium, and they pull the nutrients, their nutrients, out of the mycelium. And remember, the mycelium is getting it from the tree. So it's a parasite on both the mushroom and the tree. Now, so we call it a mycoheterotroph, a parasite, and yet it's not that simple. We haven't quite figured it out, because if you have the Ruschula mycelium on a petri dish and you inoculate it with a little bit of a slurry from the Indian pipe, it really grows much better, much more robustly. So it's giving something back into the mix. It's always more complex than we imagine early on. All right. And these are the Ruschulas that the Indian pipe grows with, although it grows with a number of different species. So what can damage those relationships? How many people here have your chanterelle spots where you collect them every year if we get enough rain? And what would stop them from fruiting in that forest? Some people say, as they watch the harvest of chanterelles fall in Central Europe, they said it's the damn mushroomers. They're over-harvesting. And so there's some studies that have been done around the world, some in Oregon and Washington, some in Central Europe, that have these forests set aside. And they study, they've got 3 different plots in a similar forest. In one, they're not collecting any of the chanterelles, they're just watching how many grow every year. In the second one, they're cutting the chanterelles off at soil level with a knife, then counting how many refruit every year. And in the third one, they're plucking them, counting how many. And over, I think the last time I saw this published was about year 20 of the study in Oregon. And they found, using the non-harvest as a control, where they cut the chanterelles, there was slightly reduced fruiting over the years. And where they plucked them, there was slightly increased fruiting over the years. But neither one's statistically significant from the control. So harvesting doesn't damage future growth. So long as the trees stay healthy, so as long as you're not messing up the duff of the forest and compacting that soil, and certainly cutting the trees or removing them will do it a lot. Now, changing weather patterns, that's a whole another ballgame. So what are we seeing as weather patterns? Our springs start out wet and they get dry quick. Past several years, they get dry just as the morels that I collect are starting to mature and they get fried. Some of them do. So springs tend to be hotter, drier. Summers, much hotter, drier most years. And the rains we get are more intermittent and they're heavier. So intense storms, but less frequent. And then we have this lovely extended autumn weather that goes until November 15th, December. Some years I'm collecting some of the cold hardy mushrooms until early December along the coast. So that's what we're seeing. And that's affecting, the range of species of mushrooms. And over time, it's going to affect the tree distribution in our forest slowly over time. And that is the biggest thing that's going to impact what mushrooms we find, what trees are able to thrive and survive. So what's the impact of climate? Pattern and season of fruiting, the mix of mushrooms that we see. And there are winners and there are losers. Like this right now, September, we have a bunch of saprobes that are thriving because of that hot, dry summer we had. But the mycorrhizal mushrooms, they're hurt. Unless you're over in the western part of the state that's more moist. This is a great one. This is that purple spored puffball. Usually averages out 5 to 6 inches in diameter. It's a great edible when it's young and firm. Boy, all over the place. Likes those hot, dry shoulders of lawns and field edges. So I want to talk about a few mushrooms that you should introduce yourself to over the coming months. Now, some of these, if you're right down here in this cold boreal forest along the coast, you're not going to see. Some of them you will. So let's talk about these. The top one there is the hen of the woods, and we'll get to it. And I call these are a group of mushrooms that I call the foolproof mushrooms. Now, I know that a fool can beat me on this if they really try. But they're pretty, by foolproof, this is the definition. I'm going based on Clyde Christensen's definition in 1939. He said mushrooms that are common, that are easily identified without toxic lookalikes, and have a good history of edibility. Those are the foolproof. And he had a foolproof 4. And when I started looking at this, I said, 4? You got to be kidding. So I tried to come up with my own system. Is it going to be a sexy 6, a nifty 9? What is it going to be? And so I call it a foolproof few. So develop those mushrooms in your area that fit those characteristics. And these are among them. So obviously, we're going to include the chanterelle. And now this is not typically a fall mushroom, but I can tell you, as the rains have been delayed and are happening now, I see fresh patches of chanterelles coming over the past 2 weeks. A lot of them in some areas. And this is, without a doubt, the most commonly collected and eaten wild mushroom in New England, based on a couple surveys I've done over time. And it grows, we get into taxonomy, we're probably dealing with at least 4 different closely related species in Maine. So they grow with different trees. Some of them really love the spruce fir forests up here. Some of them grow really well with hemlocks. Really easy to recognize. And they typically grow singly or kind of trooping. How many people enjoy the smell of chanterelles? It's that fruity kind of apricot smell. It's just incredible. So this is what it typically looks like. And when you find chanterelles, you're going to find some that are little buttons just emerging, some that are half grown with those enrolled, and sometimes often you're going to find some that are totally mature, all right in the same area. And they grow slowly. So if you find that little button, it's that big, as long as the weather stays moist, it's going to grow and it'll mature 2, 3, 4 weeks. There's a study done on some of those wet forests in the West Coast that showed that chanterelles' average age of a fruiting body before it declined was up to 3 months, 90 days. So they grow slowly. It gets dry and hot, then that kind of cuts that out. So they're wonderful, and they don't have these knife edge gills. They're kind of blunted and they fork, and that color, that golden yellow, is the top, the underside where the spore is made, and the stem, all the same color, with one exception I'll show you in a minute. So here's one that's larger, and this is one that has a pale, kind of whitish stalk. Other than that, it's the same. This one grows with hardwoods. I find it with oak and beech. It's lovely. It gets, sometimes easily the size of my hand, as you can see my hand there. Now, this is the one that sometimes people overcome their common sense and eat this. This is the jack-o'-lantern. Jack-o'-lantern mushroom is decidedly orange, not golden yellow. It has knife edge gills that don't fork, and it grows in these dense, what's called cespitose clusters, 10, 20, 30, 40 caps growing from a single spot. They're toxic. If you eat this mushroom, let's just say you're going to worship at the porcelain bowl, on average of 5 to 7 hours. Really unpleasant. Not life-threatening unless your health is already compromised. Then it could be. And so here we have the classic orange jack-o'-lantern mushroom with those very knife-edged gills, and the golden chanterelle with more blunted gills. If you ever see them side by each, you'll never make the mistake. And so if someone calls you and says, oh, I found this incredible big cluster of chanterelles, say, I don't want any, and I suggest you don't eat them. Yesterday, I took a call from the Poison Center. Family of 3, mom, her adult daughter, and her daughter's fiance. Fiance had gone out and collected these chanterelles. Big batch. And mom said, they don't look quite right. They don't look quite right. She took one little bite. They had a meal, and they were quite ill. Yeah. So that's the jack-o'-lantern and the chanterelle. The magic thing about the jack-o'-lantern, if you get them fresh, they actually glow in the dark. Bioluminescence, magic. So related to the golden chanterelles are the black trumpets. Same family, different genus, same overall vase shape, but they're hollow all the way down to the base. And they're called black trumpets. The range of color typically is kind of grayish pink almost in dry seasons, and to almost black, but not quite. And they can hide pretty easily in the leaf duff. This one you're not going to find very often along the coast in these forests, unless it's a really wet year. Then sometimes you'll find them. I do find them a lot with hemlocks, but they love oaks, oak, beech, hemlock forest. That's the right mix. And there's nothing better. They call this the poor man truffle, or in France, they call it the trumpet of death. And I used to think they called it that because they didn't want anybody who'd not eaten them to try them. But actually, in provincial France, a funeral procession was headed by someone blowing a black trumpet. And so that's why they called it that. They're gorgeous, easy to find when they're on moss, harder to find when they're in the soil. But if you find them, and this was a classic example, when I took this photograph that day, my son had said, all right, Dad, I'm ready to start mushrooming again. He's 28. This was 2 years ago. So we went into a place where I knew sometimes there were black trumpets. And we were walking along. It was a great thing. My son found the first patch. And when you find that first patch, you know you're in the right territory. And so we started going in concentric circles. And it wasn't until I was about 120 yards away, I walked into a place where you couldn't believe how many black trumpets there were. But it was that right mix of trees. Gorgeous. Easy to cook, easy to dry. If you've got a lot of them, well worth using. And in midsummer, if they fruit late like this, look for the golden, the yellowfoot chanterelle. It's easier to see. It grows in the same habitat. It's one of my indicators. How many people here have collected and consumed black trumpets? Not enough of you. When the surveys I've done, both years, it was the second most popular forage and eaten mushroom. And those people, I had people rate from 1 to 10 their favorite down. And those who had collected this by far had more number one votes for it. Another one, now I have the caveats on this one because I'm going to give you little warnings. This is called the chicken of the woods or the sulfur shelf. Ladeoporus sulphureus or cincinnatus are two related species. And it's really common on oaks. It's common on big ash occasionally, on cherry and a few other things. And it's they call it a butt rotter. It rots typically the lower end of a tree and the major roots, the heartwood of those. And it can grow on a living tree or it can continue to fruit on a tree that has died. And I find this, typically there are some that come almost every month, a little heavy flush in June, then intermittently through the summer, and then a heavy flush right now. I saw it in 3 different places driving from Augusta to here today, just along the road. And you want to get it when it's young and tender, kind of like this, or a little bit older. This is still, it's starting to get a little fibrous. And then if it gets older, it's too fibrous and it doesn't agree with us. And this doesn't agree with anybody sometimes. Let's see. And it doesn't agree with everybody all the time. How's that? I don't know. About 3 to 5%, I would say, of people can't tolerate this. They get sick. So first time you try it, try a little bit. This is one I don't take to the potluck dinner. And if you eat it raw or undercooked, you'll get sick. It's got a heat labile toxin in it, but then so do morels. Best used when it's young, does well with a longer cooking if it's at all older. But if it's really young and tender, it's great in stir fries. It holds that color, so it's beautifully mixed with vegetables or chicken. And here's a perfect fall mushroom. This is called Coprinus comatus, the shaggy mane. This is a mushroom that I start to look for around the first frost. And it's a classic, it likes disturbed ground, where you've been moving stuff around and burying organic matter, where you've kind of finally redone that entrance road, the dirt road, and when you push things around, it buried some of the wood and brush along the side. That's where this is going to fruit. And then it fruits sometimes really, really heavily for a few years, and then it's consumed. It's a saprobe. It consumes the available resources, and then you're going to have to find it someplace else. So sometimes there's a lot of them. And it's one of the inky caps. So that means when it's young, it's pure, firm, white, lovely, and as it starts to mature, the gills start to melt. The deliquesce is the fancy term. They turn into this black inky mass. Now I eat this, I collect it and eat it from here down. And when it gets there, I leave it. And if you collect this afternoon and it's a little bit mature, like these ones, cook them today. Because if you put them in your refrigerator, that inkinization, that's my term, is going to continue and they're going to become a messy black blot in your refrigerator. But they have lovely flavor. The book I wrote, Structural Dreams, I have a cream of mushroom soup, mushroom leek soup with those. It's one of my favorites. And so this photograph was taken in the lawn at the Machias Saving Bank in Machias, not Machias, in Rangeley a few years ago. And there were probably 300 shaggy manes on that lawn that afternoon. They'd totally redone their bedding. So when it comes, it can come heavily. How many people eat this? This is the second mushroom I ever ate. I used to find it fruiting on the campus of the University of New Mexico late in the fall, end of October, early into November. This one place. So this is another one. I don't often keep this as a foolproof, but it should be. This is the closest equivalent we have to the supermarket mushroom. This is the Agaricus campestris or related ones, the meadow mushroom or field mushroom. Sometimes people call it the pink bottom, and I'll show you why in a second. And this is one, this year, over the past few weeks, you could have filled baskets full in many areas. It likes grassy areas, fields, road edges, your lawns. And when it first starts out and it first opens, the gills underneath that cap are just pure pink, hence the name pink bottom. And then as it ages, it goes from pink to pinkish brown to brownish pink to more brown to dark brown as it matures. And as it matures, it develops a stronger mushroom in flavor. So if you want a really mild one, you get them when they're young. Some people eat them raw in salads like we do with supermarket mushrooms. And if you find a lot of them, so what I do is I make a sauce duxelles. So I get my biggest saute pan and I chop them coarsely and I put them in there. I usually use butter. You can use other oils and you cook them. And you bring them, when mushrooms start to cook, they give off their water. And I may add a little bit of salt, sometimes some herbs, and I cook them. And I cook them until that much of the water boils off and it's a really thick kind of brown paste. Not the most appetizing color, but deep, deep, rich flavor. And then I freeze them in the bottom of muffin tins. So you end up with these little brown hockey pucks that you can put in a Ziploc bag in your freezer for a dose of really rich mushroom flavor through the winter. Some people dry them to preserve them as well. So they're a lovely mushroom. So here's the kind of range of stages. And this one, I took this photograph about a month ago. And some of those mushrooms ended up over my fire as I cooked dinner that night. So another mushroom, and you're going to need to find oak trees or big ash trees to find this here. And I know on a lot of these peninsulas, oak is pretty unusual, though in towns, Blue Hill, a lot of oaks in that area. Actually, some of that peninsula's got a lot of oak. This is really common, and it's another one of those butt rotters on the lower end, primarily of oaks, sometimes ash, and it's slowly rotting that heartwood. And if you find it, it grew fruits on the ground around the tree, usually starting about now. When we get those nights that get down into the lower 50s, that's the trigger, and we need obviously adequate rain. And it's a good medicinal, and it's a really nice edible. So oftentimes on a large tree, and you find it most commonly on big over mature trees, there can be multiple clusters around the tree. And the first time I ever found this was about a year or two after I moved to Maine, so about 1982, 1983. And that oak tree is still alive, it's essentially hollow, and it still fruits maitake every few years. So if you find this a tree, even if you find it into October and the mushrooms are rotting, you're never going to use those ones, mark where that tree is, and you start looking every year. Now a living tree will not always fruit every year, but every other year or so on average. Last year, every tree that I was aware of was fruiting it, but I don't think it'll happen this year. And oftentimes I find these well into October. The first really, really hard frost is going to stop the growth. They're great edible. And you can find typically, 10 to 12 inches in diameter when they're mature. This is a young one about 5-6 inches in diameter. And that tree, when I took this photograph, I think there were 23 clusters starting around this big old oak tree that day. This is more mature. The pores underneath those little leaflets are a spoon-shaped fronds are pure white at this stage. If they start to yellow, it means it's getting too mature. It's just lovely. These two actually were growing at the base of a beech tree. Sometimes I find them on beech trees down near water. It's a good medicinal. There was some early on clinical trials to use this as a cancer drug. I don't think they couldn't figure out how they were going to make enough money to go through the rest of the trials, so they stopped. But it's still an excellent immune stimulator. I find it just great food and functional food. And I think one of the last ones we're going to talk about is the oyster mushroom. And I'm going to call them oyster mushrooms. because in Maine, we have 3 common species. This is a mushroom you're going to find in the late spring, early summer on aspens and poplar, one species. You're going to find it in the heat of the midsummer if there's adequate rain on beech and maple mostly. And you're going to find it at the end of the fall, mostly on sugar maple. That's the one most people associate with the oyster mushrooms, Pleurotus austriatus. And it's a really vigorous, aggressive rotter of those woods. So this was a tree just outside Hope, Maine. I drove by and I saw it. Whoa. So I went up, as I typically do. I try always. I could see whose house it was, so I knocked on the door, introduced myself, and said, "Hey, I noticed your maple out there is just filled with oyster mushroom. Do you mind if I take some photographs and maybe take some home?" And typically people look at me like I have 2 heads when I make that request. And he said, "All right, sure, but why don't you save some for me?" And how could I not save some for him? Yeah, those were just perfect condition. A little under mature yet. Oyster mushrooms like a long, slow cooking because they're fairly tough. So it's a great edible, really flavorful, easy to cultivate. And if you struggle with high cholesterol, eat more oyster mushrooms. Part of the benefits of it is it has a lovastatin-like mevinolin that lowers blood cholesterol, improves the lipid profile. I'm not saying throw out your statins. That's not my job, but definitely eat more oyster mushrooms. This is the one that grows in midsummer. A little bit smaller, a little paler usually. Lovely flavor. Of the 3, this one has the best flavor, though you have to cut off those little stems. They're a little bit tough. But keep your eyes open for oysters. Oh, I guess we do have another one, maybe 2. This is another one. And up here, if you live in woods where there are either a lot of birch or a lot of beech, you're going to find this. It also grows sometimes on maple. And Hericium, it's one of the tooth mushrooms, and it's like this ice fall of teeth, pure white. One version, a little bit pale pink when it's young. And you can also find these commonly cultivated, Erinaceus, the lion's mane. And this is a mushroom that's a saprobe on those trees. And it's unmistakable if it's growing on wood. When it's firm and fresh. Some people I know who are pretty strict vegetarians, but who miss seafood, use this in place of seafood in a chowder. This is the variety that's more branched out. I love the flavor of this compared to the other one a lot. And I find this often on birch. But this is what they typically look like. It's just this mass of white. Unmistakable and really tasty when you want to get it pure white. It's starting to get a little bit pinkish, and soft. That means it's getting over mature. Leave it on the tree. This is a mushroom that's a good immune stimulator, but the thing that fascinates me and is getting a lot of attention, it contains a class of compounds, erinacines and herinaceones, that stimulate the production of nerve growth factor. And it doesn't immediately stimulate nerves, but the nerve growth factor, which means it's active beyond the blood-brain barrier. Been some good studies, some not so good clinical trials looking at its use for mild to moderate dementia and also damaged nerve repair. A lot of people I know, as they get to be a certain age and they start forgetting things, are starting to take Hericium regularly. I make a tincture of it because that class of compounds is alcohol soluble. It works quite well. So, any questions on mushrooms that I haven't showed you yet that you were hoping were on here?
I just want to say, if we have a question, I can either bring the mic over to you, or if Greg could repeat the question for our friends on Zoom.
All right. So long as it's growing on wood and those teeth are pointing down, and you can't confuse it for a coral mushroom. So she asked if it has a potentially deadly look-alike.
If you could repeat the question.
So what she asked is, does a lion's mane have a potentially problematic, and she used the word deadly, look-alike? And I say no. There are some coral mushrooms that grow on wood, but they point up. They're divisions, and they're really very different, and they wouldn't kill you. You might get sick to your stomach. How many people love throwing up? I don't. So yeah, be cautious, but it's they're very different. It's a pretty safe one, which is why it's in one of my foolproof ones. So I'm going to give you a little bit of guidance. If you're interested in getting into this, first I'm going to show you this, which I love. This is no mushroom hunting. Mine. They're all mine. And, you know, I have that attitude. Whether I own the forest I'm in and have always collected or not, if someone else gets those mushrooms, it annoys me. But I want to start, I use this just to invite you to think about how you collect, where you collect, and do you have permission? If I'm on someone else's land, I always try. Am I 100% successful? No, not always. I try and ask permission. And I'm amazed at how often people say, wow, I really appreciate you asking. No one ever does. And yes, of course you can go. And occasionally, rarely, like 3 times, people said, no, I'd rather you don't pick those because somebody else, we're saving them for this guy that lives up the street, kind of thing. So always ask, know whose property you're on. If you're in an area where collecting is appropriate and allowed, and it's public, why would you ever collect all of them? You wouldn't want to do that anyway, but leave some for other people. And be aware, so if you're in Acadia, it's against the law. So no collecting here. Some places they're very strict. So know whether it's allowed or not to forage. If you're on your property, it's easier. Yeah. So be responsible and be thoughtful. And if you're new at this, there's some things you want to think about. Before you ever collect mushrooms, make sure you have a way of knowing that what you collect for food is what you hope it is. So you'll need to learn the mushrooms. You need to learn the toxic ones just as seriously as you're learning the edible ones. That way, they're not going to be calling me when you sicken yourself. So use a field guide if that's comfortable for you. There's a few really good internet websites out there. How many people have been on the Facebook groups that are for mushrooming? Those are, I call them crowdsourced identification. They're an excellent way to find out what's fruiting in the region. Don't immediately rely on the identifications that are given. Over time, they're going to correct themselves as people see them, but it scares me sometimes. So take a class, join a walk. This is not a class, by the way. This is an exciting thing. But learn, you need to learn how to do it. Join the Maine Mycological Association, which is just a bunch of people that are nerdy and love mushrooms. We're not always really interested in fashion, but we have fun together. And find a mentor. If you can, if you know someone who lives in your area, whose knowledge base and judgment you trust, do whatever you need to do so that they smile when they see you coming. If they like those big, juicy, fruit-forward, somewhat dry red wines, make sure you give them one occasionally. If they don't bake, but you do, bring them cookies. And what you don't do, you don't say, hey, can I go out in the woods with you where you collect mushrooms? And by the way, can you show me your fishing hole too? But you can't say, hey, will you come over and walk my property with me and show me what's here and what might be here, and I'll make you dinner? So it's because they can do so much to increase your learning curve. Be nice to them. And then when you start collecting mushrooms, you want to go slow and stay safe. You know the birders who really seek to have the longest life list of birds that they've seen? Don't do that with mushrooms that you're going to eat. So you want to start slow, start with those foolproof mushrooms, and think about not how many mushrooms I can eat, but what mushrooms I can enjoy and eat safely. You want to make sure you're collecting from uncontaminated ground. I collect mushrooms off golf courses, but I would never eat them. And if your neighbor has that lawn that belongs in House Beautiful, you know that didn't come cheap. and it usually required some additional chemical additions. Yeah. So uncontaminated ground, busy roadways or suspect, back roads I don't worry about. And for food, use only those mushrooms that are firm and prime, unblemished. Now for identification, try and get a range of ages and stages so you know how it changes as it grows. That's great for identification. Learn to make a spore print, learn the typical techniques for identification. And I don't know how many times I've collected mushrooms thinking it was edible, and then I wasn't sure, and it ended up in my compost. So never eat a mushroom until you're 100% sure of its identity and its edibility. When in doubt, they say, toss it out. And then when you start eating them, always cook them well. There are some mushrooms, as I mentioned, are toxic raw or undercooked. Honey mushrooms, morels, the sulfur shelf, there's a few others, the bluets. So cook them well. And any mushroom is hard for us to digest. Their cell walls are made of things like chitin and glucans, which are indigestible. Cooking helps to break them down, making the nutrients available. If you're eating a new species, you're only eating that one species to start with. And be your own guinea pig. So if I'm eating a new species, I don't share it with my family. I don't share it with the neighbors. For God's sakes, I don't take it to potluck. Yeah. And one at a time, because if you find 5 edible mushrooms and you throw them in a pot and you cook them up and you get sick, that's 5 mushrooms you'll never eat. And you don't know which one made you sick. So one at a time. Also, it enables you to learn the texture and the flavor of that species. And texture, flavor, smell, it really does vary quite a lot. So one at a time. And eat a small amount, make sure they fit you. You know, if the really typical foolproof ones, you don't have to be that cautious around, but anything you're uncertain around, take photographs. That's what they typically send me photographs for identification where there's been an exposure. Works really well. And I'm a little bit cautious sharing with people who are either vulnerable health, or who are nervous about mushrooms. I never force a mushroom on someone. And I always let them know, I'm saying, you know, these are wild mushrooms that I collected myself. This is what they are. This is what I know about them. And if someone says, I don't know, say, okay, more for me. Because there's a direct link between my anxiety and my gut. Yeah. So always let people know what they're eating. And, you know, the last part of this is really going back to nature. Make sure you're enjoying the process. For a while, I started collecting mushrooms to sell. And it ruined my relationship with the mushrooms. So I stopped because I was going to try and get as many as I could. I want to be out there for my mental health because, boy, my mental health needs it most days. Yeah. And then finally, accept that your guests may not want to eat them. Yeah. So resources, I have a couple of books, not very, that I brought in. But, you know, if you ever want to get into boletes, none of the regular field guides are going to have very many of them. You're going to have to get a bolete book. And this one, Boletes of Eastern North America by the Bassett's and Rudy, really good, really good. Still struggling. Think about if you're going to get books, do you want a book that covers like 20 mushrooms that are edible and some dangerous lookalikes, or you want to learn the mushrooms? Tim Baroni, who is a professor at University of New York in Syracuse, wrote this book. I think it's been out about 5 years. Mushrooms of the Northeastern United States and Eastern Canada. They're always big, long names. Baroni. Good book, fun, fairly well written. Each book has its own personality or lack thereof. But look at internet sites. There's a few. Mushroomexpert.com is a good one. And you'll see that in another slide or two. The one that I use a lot, if you read French at all, Myco Quebec. It's the consortium of mycologists up in the Quebec. I don't read French well at all, but it's the website I use most of any, because it's got all of our mushrooms plus some. So find that mentor, join the Maine Mycological Association, costs all of about $12 a year for a family, and take your time. Don't be in a rush. So Chanterelle Dreams, I think I only have 5 copies of that, but I'm happy to sell it. It's still available in various places. And it's not an identification book. It does cover some of the foolproof mushrooms with recipes. It also covers some of the common toxic mushrooms and the mistakes made, as well as a couple of chapters on psychoactive mushrooms. Fun. And then other books. So for the ones for just learning, Gary Linkoff, The Complete Mushroom Hunter, is one of those romps through a few mushrooms, through books. David Sparr's book for the Northeast, Edible and Medicinal Mushrooms. I don't have that on here, but many people know it. The internet site, this is themushroommexpert.com. Now, he made a decision, Michael Quo, early on. He says, I'm not going to make any statements about edibility or toxicity. I'm just going to focus on identification. My cookies, my toys, my choice. So that's what he does. You'll have to find out about edibility in other sites. Now, Michael Quebec, though it's in French, like all French, they're quite bold about their eating mushrooms. So they do a lot. So Facebook sites, as I mentioned, there's several in Maine. There's a good one in New Hampshire and Vermont as well. And finally, to come back to this, really, when you come down to it, it's a way to escape the busyness of your life, to have good exercise, to invite the ticks into your life as well, and to appreciate nature. And for me, let the beauty you love be what you do. There are truly 1,000 ways to kneel and kiss the earth. And for me, mushrooming is one of those. So this is where I open it up for any other questions. And I guess if we want to do questions through the chat as well, I'll take those. So if you say a question, I'm going to repeat it so that the folks who are on Zoom will hear it as well. And thank you. Yes, no questions are off topic anymore. Now, the false chanterelle is a smaller mushroom, and we're dealing with common names. So no, typically that's Hygrophilopsis aurantiacus. It's a little saprobe, typically not more than about 3 inches in diameter. Does not usually grow in clusters. Usually more orange. Some people eat that. Some people have trouble with it. And it's not really common. Although sometimes on wood chips, late October, I find a lot of them. Yeah. But that's one that usually is called the false chanterelle. Yes, sir.
I found mushrooms, chanterelles, growing once or twice over the years. One was right outside the entrance to the institute here, where the white line on both sides of the road was grass.
Yeah.
Haven't seen never found one again. But other spots back here.
Well, the difference is, so thank you very much. So she says, right here in the entranceway here, one year I found lines of chanterelles, both sides of the road, big ones, robust, never again. Other places I find them every year. They're really loyal. And chanterelles, wildly, they're usually pretty loyal. Except if you get a really wet year, those ideal conditions, you're going to find them where the mycelium has been growing with the roots, but they just haven't had the right conditions to fruit, and they'll see them abundantly. Black trumpets, even more so. Chanterelles are loyal. Black trumpets are fickle. They need abundant rain. And so there are places where I usually find black trumpets every year, maybe just a few. And then you get a year like last year, where you could almost walk across the state on black trumpets. They were so plentiful. And there were places where I had not seen them before. But, it's those ideal conditions versus the average. It's a good question. But I spend my whole life trying to figure out why this one's fruiting this year and hasn't been last year, those kinds of things. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. So the question is, are there a lot of deaths in this country? From eating poisonous mushrooms? No. On average, maybe 3, on a bad year to 5 people die across the country from mushroom poisoning. A lot more get sick, various levels of sickness, but death is pretty uncommon. We have had some, we've got the group that typically cause sickenings that can cause death are among the amanitas and the related amatoxins. And those, if you eat the mushroom, and by those people who've eaten them, they say, well, they taste really good. About 8 hours, 6 to 10 hours after you eat them, you develop symptoms. So delayed onset, severe gastrointestinal stuff for about 25 hours, 24 hours, and then it resolves. And unless they've been testing your liver enzymes, they'll send you home. And you come back in another 25 to 30 hours showing signs of liver failure because it'll destroy your liver's functioning. And that's what kills you. Very severe. So you need to know. But, America up until recently, we're in a lot of mushroom foraging. So we didn't have a lot of significant toxicity. So the less severe poisonings I'm seeing rising just in my experience through the Northern New England Poison Center in the 3-state area. And we're seeing that across the country because more people are out there and more people are they're taking chances. They're in a hurry to learn mushrooms and eat them. And so their enthusiasm gets ahead of their knowledge. And that's the danger part. Yeah. So you were first.
I found these little purple jellies, and I looked everything I have in mushroom, and it says they're edible, and there's nothing else like it.
Purple jellies?
They're little tiny purple jellies, about 9
So what she asked is, I'm finding these little purple jellies. They're little.
And I looked them up in my mushroom book, and they say they're edible.
All right. Are there little purple cups?
No, they're like little sticks.
All right. Well, you're gonna have to show me a picture because I'm not sure. Yeah.
And like the chaga, I don't know enough about them, that's why I'm here to find out.
You're starting.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. Yes, sir.
Collect lobster mushrooms, and if so, how do you identify the underlying
Do I?
lobster mushroom?
Oh, lobster mushrooms. So she says, do I collect lobster mushrooms and how do I identify what species it's growing on? So a lobster mushroom is this bright cooked lobster orange fungus that is a parasite on species of Russula and Lactarius. And so what he's asking is, how do you know what species it's growing on? Because the old books say you don't want to eat that lobster mushroom unless it's growing on an edible Russula, because it's a parasite. It takes over that mushroom. And of course, you never know. You just don't know. And I was dealing with a complex toxicity poisoning case, and I tried to get a list of the species that it grows on. No one has it. But very, very, very few cases of toxic reaction to that mushroom worldwide. So I don't care what they say. If it's parasitized, it takes care of those issues. Yeah. You can quote me on that. Yes? Porcini. I love this. Yeah. So the question is, why do I not include the porcini, the king bolete, the porcini, the steinpilz, the pinnibum, the cep, different names, different countries on my list of foolproof? Because they're not. Boletes are hard. And there's a look-alike. In fact, I've had some cases in Maine from people from away, typically Eastern Europe, who've collected what they think is this significant, firm, gorgeous cep or porcini, and they cook it up and they get really sick. It's Boletus heronensis. So I'd say, for me, boletes are an intermediate. I eat a lot of them and I love them. I had some porcini that I just took out of my dryer day before yesterday that I collected over the weekend. I dry them and use them a lot, but for some of them especially, it's taken me some time to learn them. And in Maine, we have about 6 species that are in that edulous, that king bolete group. And they're all good, but I don't call them simple. Yeah. Up to that corner. So the question is, do I know anything about the white button mushrooms, which is Agaricus bisporus, in cancer treatment? No. I know that there's a couple of different Agaricus. There's one called Agaricus blazei, which is an Asian species. They've done a lot of research on use of it in cancer, but I don't know specifically about bisporus. Yes, sir. So what he asks is can you buy soil or amendments that are already inoculated with mycorrhizals to plant with trees and plants? Yes, you can actually get inoculum, or they have now some soil mixes that they're already inoculated. Yeah.
I don't know.
I'm not sure. Let your fingers do the walking on your computer. Yeah, I'm not sure where to get it specifically. Yep. So North Spore is a company out of Westbrook, and I guess they've got some. Anything you get. North Spore is a really reputable group of folks. I like them a lot. North Spore, 2 words. They're just about to open their new facility in Westbrook. Yeah. So, so what she's asking is, I mentioned the growing interest in mushrooms, and she has, is there a parallel growing interest in mushrooms are used medicinally? And I say, I do a lot of like day-long classes, 2-day classes, and I often ask, starting out, what is your primary interest? And there's people interested in both medicinal and edible. There's a number of people interested in medicinal, so there's absolutely exploding interest. And there's some really good research that shows their use. None of it is going to, for the most part, satisfy that FDA approval as medicine, because they're not going to make enough money. It costs estimated about $1 billion to get it through that. But they're great. There's some good research behind them. And with everything that's popular, there could be snake oil salesmen. So make sure you're doing your research. I wrote a book on the use of the kind of common medicinal mushrooms up here. I really base it on the research, but there's been some claims made that I don't support, and I don't see any literature. We all have to be eyes wide open. Anything else from the chat you want to bring forward?
No, another question here from Laura on the chat. If a mushroom is toxic, is it most often toxic to insects and wildlife too?
Actually, the question is, if it's toxic to humans, is it toxic to wildlife and insects? I often get the other way around. So if I find the mushroom has been clearly eaten by something, a wild animal or a wild insect, can I eat it? And the answer to that is no. But my guess is, our systems are different. Insects can eat a lot of things we're not able to, but I don't know if they would be sickened by everything that we're sickened by. So I've never really thought deeply about it from that direction. It's a good question. So, yes, sir.
Talk about it applies to here. Does it apply to other regions of the country too, or?
What he asked is, so we're talking about the Northeast, we're talking about Maine. Would it apply to California? There's a lot of similarities. Always, we're going to have different mushrooms here than they have in California. Some of them are the same. I did a medicinal talk to the Marin Mycological Association last year, and I did some research on some of the species that are different there that applied versus here. But by and large, a lot of similarities. It's more problematic if you're coming, say, from Southeast Asia and more tropical area and try and apply that here. There's a lot more differences. Yeah. Where I'm going to invite you to put your name and email down. If you're interested in great natural history seminars, look up Eagle Hill Institute in the lovely, large metropolis of Steuben. And they've been doing these for like 35 years. And my friend Michaeline and I have been teaching a mushroom identification 5-day seminar there for 13 years. We call it Mushroom Camp, and it's fun. Yeah. And if you usually I send out a schedule of where I'm going to be teaching sometime in around June or so. I don't keep a website. I'm too busy doing other things. So, yes, sir.
There's a formula in capsule format. That's like 7 supposedly very healthy mushrooms, but it's powdered form. And I'm just wondering, like, it's become general. Is that still have this good power of being effective?
So he's talking about taking a capsule of mixed mushroom species powdered, and is what vehicle is best? So it's going to depend a little bit on the mushroom. More than anything else, you want to make sure that the preparation you're getting is from a reputable source. So there are some people that are doing really good work. There's more interest in growing out on mycelium in a vat culture and then drying that. And that's good with some species and not effective with others. The folks at North Spore are doing some more preparations. I really trust them. I know them. The folks, Paul Stammett's crew, they generally do good work. If you're getting it on the internet from someplace in China you don't know about, yeah. Always question your source, because really for medicinal mushrooms as well, how is it grown? What is it cared for? What's it grown on? That's also going to make an impact on the final product. You're going to chase me out of here?
Greg, thank you so much for coming tonight. And thank you everyone for joining us. I just wanted to remind for those of you that are in the room, Greg did start passing out an email list if you would like more information from him. If you're in the chat, I think you can leave your email with us and we'll be able to save the chat and pass that along to Greg later on. Also, just a reminder, Greg has a few books for sale if anyone is interested, and otherwise have a wonderful evening, everybody. We hope to see you again soon.
And thanks Scudic Peninsula or Scudic Institute for putting this on. And I'll hang out for a while down here for individual questions if you have any. If you bring me those pictures of the 20 mushrooms you took pictures of this summer, I'll laugh.